All right, so do you know how many Zunes you can buy with $108 million?
I would hazard a guess, at least a few.
So fun fact, it's just under 500,000, which is enough to give not one, but 2 Zunes for free to everybody in Microsoft.
Huh.
And the importance of the 108 million isn't the Zune so much, it's more so the amount of money I wish I had in my bank account, but also the average cost of a major security incident for companies in between responding to it, any kind of revenue loss. So it's quite a large sum.
That is quite a large sum, and it looks like we have an audience. So hello everyone, and welcome to BlueHat Day 1. My name is Sesha Machiraju, and I'm joined by my colleague Justin Mourfield, and we're here to talk you through our presentation, Creating a Transparent Cloud Industry.
So, there we go. Nope, one slide. All right, bear with me. I'm gonna click to the next slide and do intros, and then I'll come back. Okay, oh, all right, thanks. All right, so before we get started, hi, my name is Justin Mourfield. I'm learning how to use a slide clicker, but I work in MSRC. I run everybody's favorite process, which is Patch Tuesday, and I handle all of our CVE disclosures. But before this, I was in Azure CXP, where Sesha is from, and we had a lot of experience working with communications and customers, so the importance of transparency and working well to support our customers is kind of the crux of what I like to do.
And I'm the other half of the dynamic duo. My name is Sesha. I'm a technical program manager in Azure CXP, where I spend most of my time in security incident response. As my side hustle, I'm also our SME for all of our customer advocacy programs, including our cloud incident readiness events, along with Azure Social. In my spare time, big fan of running, baking, albeit terribly, so don't try my cakes, they're terrible. Volunteering at my neighborhood historical society. And so with that, take it away, Justin.
All right.
Nice.
Oh, it didn't work, darn it. All right. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the concept of being more transparent as an industry regarding cloud vulnerabilities. Now, with customers starting to adopt and grow their use of the cloud, it puts an inherent trust and responsibility in us as CSPs to protect their data, provide secure products. But there are a lot of different difficulties that we experience as an industry, as individual companies. But there are ways to solve that and different methods that we can use to support both providing the information, but also enabling ourselves to protect our companies and our products. So we'll start off with talking just briefly about the Microsoft Secure Future Initiative. I'm sure it's a concept that most of everybody has heard. Now, the importance of this is that there's 6 different pillars within SFI. They're very reminiscent of the different security domains that we see, but what the security domains lack is something that is explicit to transparency. Our 6th pillar, which is the accelerating response and remediation, is where we're accounting for increasing our transparency and what we're using to kind of evangelize the overall need for the industry to be more transparent. Now, SFI is internal facing. It's securing our operations, securing our design of products, but it's also changing our culture and how we approach security. So what we're more or less advocating for in terms of this presentation is the need to change the culture of our entire industry and have a more cooperative and collaborative approach to how we work as individual CSPs across the board. SFI focuses primarily on establishing some of the standard best practices and paved paths, as we call them. And so as we move forward through this, we'll talk more about the standards that we're establishing and the paved paths that we're making. So go ahead and pass it over to Sesha to talk more about Pillar 6.
Awesome. So specific to SFI's Pillar 6, or Accelerating Response and Remediation, we have 3 standards. And for the purposes of our presentation, we're going to focus on Standard 2, or Transparently Communicate Vulnerability Mitigations to accelerate broad adoption, and Standard 3, apply consistent standards for effective and accurate communications. We have a number of initiatives that we're taking on to accomplish those standards. They're listed at the bottom of the page here in the What We Are Doing section, and we'll also talk through all of these in the next few slides. And so take it away, Justin.
All right. So just brief history on CVEs, if you're not familiar with them, to give you a little bit of context. So CVEs were created in 1999, and it standardized the way that we, across the board, talk about vulnerabilities. Now, this is important because without that, one company is going to do something else from everybody else. It's going to make it difficult to understand what the risk is, how you mitigate. So this established a commonality across that. But this was also created when Y2K was the biggest concern for everybody regarding technology, and the internet still made noise when you connected to it. So it didn't have any kind of consideration for cloud products or services, and therefore the criteria for assigning a CVE was based on an on-prem product being affected by a vulnerability and the need for customer action to mitigate that vulnerability. So as we've moved forward in time and the cloud has been created, the lack of a consideration for these different products made it very difficult for us to talk consistently about vulnerabilities, which the CVEs were intended to do. Those rules recently changed, and we can assign a CVE to cloud vulnerabilities, but there's still variance in when that's done, how it's done, and who supports it. Some of the more critical pieces of a CVE are the CVSS score, the exploitation data, and I would also argue the CWE, which we'll talk more about later on. Without being required to provide this information, CSPs have the freedom to choose which one or what data they do and don't provide. But for customers, the CVSS score, the exploitation data, those are two of the most critical pieces. It allows you to understand the risk and assess what it means for your environment, and then also know if it's been exploited by threat actors in the wild. So it's incredibly imperative that it's provided in order to enable them to secure their environments. So I'll show some examples real quick of CVEs that have been published and kind of the variations. Caveat, this is not finger pointing or saying Microsoft does it best, but these are examples of just how we approach CVEs versus others across the board. So if you notice, the publishing authority is MITRE, which is not the company which owned the product which was affected. So why is this important? Well, if you're a customer and you're wanting to find the vulnerabilities that affect your products that you use, you may try searching based on the vendor who is providing them. If this CVE is published by somebody else, though, it's going to make it a little bit more complex to identify that information. Also, the CVSS score was not assigned by the product vendor. It was assigned by CISA, which kudos to CISA for making sure this data is provided at some point, but they have to rely on publicly available information in order to make that assessment. If there's one thing that is consistent across the board already, it's that nobody likes to provide more information about vulnerabilities than we have to. At least that's been a historic approach. So they may not have the most accurate assessment of the score, the impact, the risk that it poses. We as the providers know it best, because why? Well, we created the products and we mitigated the vulnerability. So it's important that this is provided by who the owner of that product is. Now, in comparison, some of the CVEs that we publish, you can see, are published by Microsoft at the top right. We've assigned the score. CISA does go and validate it, which is a great mechanism for collaborating and making sure that there's a information quality and validation mechanism. And we've also provided the CWE, which, again, I'll talk about a little bit later on. All these are optional, and whether you provide that information or not, how you go about publishing them. And without a consistent approach to that publication of a CVE, it makes it difficult for customers, as I've said, to secure themselves and for us across the board to secure our products. So we're going to look at some case studies that Sesha is presenting where all of us were, or multiple cloud providers were affected by a similar vulnerability. And I guess postulate on the aspects of whether or not this could have been prevented by sharing and working together.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. So I'm going to talk through a few vulnerabilities across the industry, and we can start examining some of the commonalities between them. The first of which is very near and dear to my heart. It was actually the first case I was an incident responder on, and it's the Azure Cosmos DB Jupyter Notebooks vulnerability. It was reported to us by Wiz in August of 2021. Shout out to Wiz, they're actually here presenting tomorrow, so go check out their presentation if you can. And it was an SSRF vulnerability that could have allowed an attacker to access another user's resources via the account's read-write key. And so SSRF was the main ingress point. At that point, an attacker could have been able to access restricted networks as well as the IMDS. We could have at that point seen elevation of privilege that would have compromised the host node, and finally an attacker could have allowed for a lateral movement, meaning that they could go and access other users' resources. And so this was triaged by MSRC and mitigated very shortly after by our engineering teams. And my team, we sent out communications to impacted Azure customers. And our communication was focused around asking customers to rotate credentials. And really, we were hoping to be transparent and to share information that we could. We also published an MSRC blog, and around the same time, Wiz published a blog as well, naming the vulnerability Chaos DB. And chaos indeed it was. Over the next few days and weeks, we saw a huge amount of escalations from reporters to account teams and customers specifically who were asking, they didn't know if they were mitigated, they didn't know if they were impacted. There was a lot of confusion surrounding this vulnerability. And so we realized that one, our communication was vague, and two, we needed to pivot our strategy to being a bit more transparent. Also interesting to note in this case that we didn't assign a CVE. This will become important very shortly, but let's go to the next slide.
You want to hold the power?
Sure. Oh, no, go back one. If it'll work. Okay.
We got to move the IR thing over here.
Let's talk through a few other vulnerabilities across the industry. The first of which is CloudFormation in AWS. So this was reported by Orca Security in January of 2022, just a few short months after Chaos DB, and it was an XXE vulnerability that enabled SSRF to be performed against AWS's CloudFormation. It disclosed config files and credentials that could have allowed an increased scope of impact. Similar to the previous case, the vulnerability was mitigated immediately, and we didn't assign a CVE, or AWS didn't assign a CVE. Another case, apiary in Oracle Cloud Services. This was reported just a month later in February of 2022. Kudos to Orca for reporting a second vulnerability. And it was an SSRF vulnerability that enabled access to Oracle's IMDS. The impact was considered to be an online service, but IMDS is a high-value target due to its relationship to the cloud. Similarly, vulnerability was mitigated immediately, and no CVE was assigned. So now when we look at these three vulnerabilities, we see that they have the commonality of no CVE is assigned, despite we see that this is across the industry, 3 different CSPs, 3 different services, and somehow no CVE assigned. And so the commonalities are interesting, and especially when you think back on Justin's point where we were just saying, maybe this would have been mitigated or would have been a little bit easier for customers had we assigned a CVE at the time. And so if we look forward, we can start looking at what were the impact to customers and industry. From a customer standpoint, because we didn't have this centralized repository of information where we could have vulnerability information into one place, there was no way for customers to check mitigation guidance or what actions to take during these vulnerabilities. And so it created a lot of confusion and a lot of panic. I'll hand it off to Justin to talk through the industry.
I have the power. All right. Couldn't pass up the He-Man reference. All right, so impact to the industry. I think at the core of what we're trying to showcase with these different case studies is that, number one, if we're not providing the data as the CSP, the upstream organizations such as CISA, NBD, they have the burden of trying to determine this and provide it. Additionally, the lack of utilization of a CVE for a cloud vulnerability, albeit when these incidents happened, the rules didn't allow for that. Now they do, but there's still an adoption that needs to take place, because without that, it does inhibit the ability for customers to protect themselves, and also us as an industry to enrich the databases such as NVD, National Vulnerability Database, with the data that helps us to identify systemic trends, helps the federal government understand what they need to be doing through building processes and policy to protect our critical infrastructure. So all in all, with the cloud becoming as important to people's day-to-day lives as your utilities, we need to work together to have these support structures enabled.
So food for thought real quick before we transition. What if we did have a centralized repository of vulnerability information? And more so, what if we had a consortium of industry leaders or CSPs that could go and start reviewing all of this data, start looking for trends, looking at TTPs of threat actors? What lengths could we take security research? And furthermore, could we diminish or even eradicate the likelihood of having these types of incidents? And so on that fun food for thought, I want to switch gears slightly and start looking at SFI's Pillar 6, and specifically how we're taking on consistent, effective, and accurate security communications. Nice. So if you remember from the SFI Pillar 6 slide, we had a number of initiatives in like the What We Are Doing section that we are taking on to accomplish those standards. And specifically in the realm of effective and accurate security communications, we have a brand new process where we're sending out Azure CVE communications via Azure Service Health. And it's targeted to specific customers that are impacted by a specific CVE, and it specifies the impacted resources at a subscription or tenant level, depending on the level the service is architected at. The COM itself will provide mitigation guidance, information about the actions to take, as well as support avenues, as well as metadata about the CVE itself. It uses this established and trusted source, Azure Service Health, for resource impacting issues. And the goals, going back to SFI, are to increase transparency, decrease the customer time to mitigate, and overall make the customer response process easier. The second of our new initiatives is MSRC advisories. So this is for the case when CVEs may not be warranted, but customer awareness is. And we want to share information even when we may not need a CVE, but we want to be transparent about a vulnerability. So these are published alongside CVEs and MSRC's Security Update Guide. And this is where we co-house all vulnerability information in one source of truth. And so this goes back to the idea of having a centralized repository of information. Now if we go to our next slide, on the other hand of customer response is customer preparedness. And so this goes back to the idea of like shared responsibility between customers, CSP, and industry, where we're hoping that by enabling customers to be prepared and have all of the tools to help them be prepared, it'll make it easier for when a cloud incident does happen. And so one of the ways that we ask our customers to prepare for cloud incidents is to create Azure communication pathways specific to Azure Service Health. You can create alerts specific to the type of incident responder you are, whether that be in vulnerability management or engineering, et cetera. The biggest thing we say, though, is to ensure you have a contactable email address in Azure Service Health, because this is how Azure is going to reach out to you. The other note is we send out Azure CVEs as security advisories, so make sure that your SOC is signed up to receive these types of alerts, because we're going to send them out that way. Additionally, there are some other ways you can prepare for cloud incidents. As I just mentioned, you can sign up for Azure Service Health alerts. You can follow us on Reddit and X. You can join our quarterly cloud incident readiness events. And you can follow the documentation and implement the recommendations in our cloud incident readiness documentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Justin to talk through industry collaboration.
Thank you. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about is a couple of different methods of increasing transparency, some of which we're already doing at Microsoft, some of which we're working towards, but really what we're advocating for is a general support. These are just a few of the many different mechanisms that you can use and that are available either through federal programs or supporting different technology and methods of disclosing information. So for us, I think one of the big things that we've done recently is we've started to publish CVEs that do not require customer action. Now, this breaks the paradigm that customers needed to go and do something when a CVE was published. So you might ask, well, what's the value of that? I think first and foremost, it shows that we're trying to put our best foot forward and show what customers want, which is the vulnerabilities that affect their products, even when they don't need to go and mitigate them. They still want to know the security risks. And so it's important that we're helping to showcase those risks to them, because it builds a sense of confidence that we're being open and honest. Secondarily, it enriches the National Vulnerability Database with some of the most critical aspects about cloud vulnerabilities. With that concept of assigning a CVE to a cloud vulnerability being so new, it's very important that we start to build the data sources surrounding it. This shows our most critical vulnerabilities and feeds that data into the database. So you can start to identify systemic trends. Second, and no action CVEs kind of go hand in hand with the CWE in terms of when we started to support them. But CWE is a standardized method of discussing the root cause for a vulnerability. And vulnerability can have different root causes, but the point being is this, just like CVEs provided the industry a standardized method of talking about vulnerability itself, this lets us talk about the root cause of it. So as we start to look across the board and identify, such as the SSRF vulnerabilities that Sesha discussed, maybe there's commonalities in those root causes, and this will help us identify those and build up a more holistic resolution at scale. All right, so next, I'm going to talk about VEX. So VEX is essentially an attestation as to what products and components are affected by a vulnerability. It's essentially appended to a CVE, right? It doesn't replace a CVE, but it augments it. And some of the more important aspects of BEX is that it shows the correlation upstream and downstream in between products and components. As we've continued to build new products, we have built them upon other technologies. Right now, it's pretty hard to forecast out, all right, if there's a vulnerability in an open source product, how does that affect AKS? How does it affect Ubuntu that is used within a VM? So this kind of simplifies that correlation. Additionally, it's machine readable, and so that helps to streamline the response of customers or even ourselves, because it can be ingested directly to an SIEM tool and help to identify what products you have across your ecosystems that would contain this vulnerability and need mitigation. It also provides the mitigation guidance. So it's very, very similar in terms of the data that it provides on a CVE, but in a different format that can be used to streamline remediation. So I've mentioned a couple of times, or excuse me, Kev. Known exploitability, vulnerability, known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, excuse me, or Kev. Sounds like a great guy. His real name is Robert Paulson, but this is CISA's source of truth for any vulnerability which has been exploited in the wild. Now, this is kind of contingent upon us providing exploitability data. Otherwise, CISA has to go and try and find it themselves. And I trust their research capabilities. They are CISA. But it puts a burden on them. Also, if they don't have all the information that you as a CSP do, and it's not publicly available or findable, then they can't actually log the vulnerabilities being exploited if it was. Also, this forms the prioritization of how the federal government is mitigating their systems. So if we're not enriching this catalog with the right data, the federal government is at risk. Our critical infrastructure is at risk because they can't prioritize what updates they need to make based on some of the more critical aspects. Threat actors are always looking for opportunities to go and impact our major infrastructure and systems. So if they're already exploiting a vulnerability and it's not known, why allow that to be a risk to ourselves and the nation? So it's important to support this by providing that information. Last but not least, CVMAP. I'm not even going to try and say the unacronized version, it's way too long. But this is no good operation is complete without a QA/QC method. CVMAP is a two-way communication between the CSP and NVD regarding the data that they're providing on the CV, so the score and the CWE specifically. NVD has a team of analysts that go and look for information to corroborate our scoring or ask more questions to get guidance on why we scored something a certain way and seek more clarity and depth of the information provided. So this mechanism is a key piece that helps ensure the accuracy of CVE data, which can be trusted and relied upon by customers as well as anybody who is consuming that information.
All right, so what are the benefits of collaboration? From a customer standpoint, if we did have this centralized source of information or just a database to put all of this vulnerability information, it would make it easier for customers to be able to look at critical risk assessment data, mitigation data, and it would really create a centralized spot that they would have all of the information to look at, ensuring that there is a focus on transparency and ensuring that it's easy for them to find the information they need. From a CSP standpoint, now, when we go back to shared responsibility, now CSPs have a responsibility to put vulnerability information and populate this database, meaning that over time we can start to identify trends and CSPs can start looking at where they need to force and put more investment into their security products depending on the sort of trends they see.
So, luckily there is, as Sesha's been mentioning, kind of a centralized database for at least some of this information. That being NVD, but with all the differences in the optional data, right, the CVSS score, exploitability, CWE, they can't be useful. And so that's where, as an industry, it's impactful to our capabilities to identify systemic trends and vulnerabilities, the threats that we face. Also, looking at it from a national perspective, we're not able to secure our most critical infrastructure and protect our nation against a foreign attack. So one of the key benefits of supporting these programs, because they're optional, is it democratizes the data which we all need and what we're all seeking. It helps us to protect ourselves, protect our products, and expand that protection across our entire cloud ecosystem. It drives innovation to our products, right? As a person who's providing security products, it allows you to identify what kinds of trends you want to architect solutions for. And So the ability to drive that innovation is one of the more critical and important aspects for not just us as CSPs, but across the cybersecurity community. And so also the last point I'll make is it informs policy decision. Nobody wants policy that it isn't intelligent or that doesn't actually make sense, but we can't have policy that makes sense without providing the data to base it off of. So for the federal government, having policy around what kind of defense mechanisms need to be implemented, what processes different organizations need to have standardized, this is the way that we can help to create this policy and make it useful, make it effective.
All right, so we're nearing the end of our presentation, but we have a number of key takeaways that we wanted to share with you. The first of which is security first. So transparency is the #1 goal of the industry, and it is top of mind for customers, for the industry as we move forward. Point 2, accelerating response and remediation. So all of these proactive measures that we've discussed here are really to enable customers to ensure that they are protected and proactively ready for any cloud incident. 3, customer advocacy and shared responsibility. So this goes back to SFI's Pillar 6 and is focused on how can we ensure that we have policy that prioritizes CSPs providing information critical to customers assessing risk.
Oh, just quick slide, didn't mean to. All right, so the, let me see here. So program adoption, excuse me. As I've kind of been saying is, all of these things are optional. It's important that across all the major industry leaders, we do support them though, because of the benefits it provides to everyone involved with using our products or ourselves as the product creator. Even organizations outside of our own benefit from us adopting these programs, adopting the different standards of information data that we're providing so that it allows us to be consistent and be trusted as cloud providers. So industry collaboration is the crux of this though. If only one of us or only a handful of us are actually adopting these, then that's a forward momentum, because not everybody does right now. But across the board, we need to be consistent. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up.
All right,
I have to be aggressive with it.
So that brings us to the end of our presentation. We wanted to end with something fun, and what's more fun than Latin? So here we are. The first of our phrases that we wanted to share with you is audentis fortuna luvat, which means fortune favors the bold. And I chose this one because the challenge in front of us to create parity between the CSPs, to ensure transparency in our communications and in the industry as a whole, is no easy feat. It's definitely, but it's a worthy challenge, but no easy feat for sure. And it involves us to lean into this sense of hard work and needs us to be bold. And so to that I say, let's go forth and be bold.
And lastly, hey, it was shared. We both wanted one. So unus pro omnibus, omnis pro uno. Sure, this is an actual French literature quote, which is all for one and one for all, but Latin is more fun. So the point of this is, again, without the collaboration and mutual support, we can't protect our ecosystem. So we need to come together as CSPs, just like Knights of the Round Table, and agree to make these changes in how we operate and work together going forward. So that way, we can spend $109 million on something more fun, like buying Zunes, instead of spending it on a security incident.
Right. And that's it. Thank you, everyone.
All right, let's give them a round of applause.